All right, hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Mind Bend. Today I'm joined by Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes, who is a philosopher specializing in metaphysics and consciousness, with a focus on altered states and psychedelic experiences. He's a lecturer at the University of Exeter, and he leads their Master of Science in Psychedelics, Mind, Medicine, and Culture, and is the author of Mnemonics and Modes of Sentience. Peter's work bridges philosophy, science, and psychedelics, exploring the nature of mind and reality. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Pleasure to be here, Benjamin. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. So my first question really is, what got you interested into philosophy of mind and questions of this sort?
Well, good question. Actually, I've never thought about that. I was always interested in sort of philosophy, I suppose, although we were never taught it in English or Swedish schools. But philosophy of mind, I think that I, mm, yeah, gosh, I think it's well. I think it's because a lot of questions in philosophy, the deepest questions, it seems to me, are to do with the mind anyway, sort of the
Yep.
relationship between subjectivity and objectivity, and so on, the brain, the body, nature of machine consciousness, which was a question even 20 years ago, of course, and more than that. So I don't know, I sort of went down that route to consciousness, and I started teaching philosophy of mind, which is a very analytic form of philosophy. And
Hmm.
then um, and then I started to I was asked to teach William James at college, and the variety of his religious experience. And then he spoke about mystical consciousness induced by drugs, certain drugs. So then I became interested in that as part of, the philosophy of consciousness, really. And then I that determined my career trajectory in many ways. So I sort of went into the philosophy of psychedelic consciousness, which
Hmm.
I'm still working.
And I guess you kind of have to straddle between, well, philosophy and a bit of neuroscience as well, a bit of chemistry in that sense, because the worlds are very interconnected, right? And I guess a bit of psychology as well. So
Yeah.
how's
Yeah, no,
how,
it's
yeah.
sorry, no, I was just going to say, like, really, I specialize, I suppose, in philosophy of mind and metaphysics, but metaphysics of mind more specifically. But, as you suggest, it's all you can't really understand it fully if you exclude any other disciplines, So certainly neuroscience, but even history, the way we
Yeah.
have conceptualized the mind and language, the way we form it in different words and so on. And I mean, for example, Swedish doesn't even have a word for mind, and the German word Geist can be translated as mind or spirit, and spirit in English British English at least has these kind of religious connotations. So,
Yeah.
yeah, and then anthropology, of course, is required to understand how different cultures sort of understand the mind, if you can even talk about the mind. And there's other in certain other cultures, and yeah, so it's psychology, of course, the study of the mind, and psychiatry, pharmacology, neuroscience. It's all interrelated, I think, for a fuller picture.
Yeah, and in some sense, all roads kind of lead to mine, right? Because it's inescapable. I think even for myself, I actually began with asking more religious and spiritual questions on my own, having a
Yeah.
slightly religious background in the past. So that's the kind of things that I was thinking about. And then as my thinking kind of progressed and my interest shifted, the central tenet that I was asking myself is what is the most important question to be asking, right? In terms of meaning, in terms of self, and then that eventually landed me into the philosophy of mind as well. This is why I was so interested in this sector and why I'm studying psychology in school. Um,
Uh-huh.
yeah, to keep
That's
the
interesting.
bit of science bit as well. Yeah,
And
so yeah,
it's interesting because I came from quite a secular background. I didn't have a religious upbringing, but I got to the same place. What was your religious background exactly?
Christian, yeah, Christian.
Christian?
Yeah,
What?
but no longer the
Fundamental?
case though.
No longer the
I was a Protestant Christian, so more Methodist. Yeah, but
Methodist.
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, actually, where I live here in Cornwall. There's many Methodist chapels because John Wesley he came to this part of southwest
Oh, I
Cornwall and
see.
was very popular here amongst working class and amongst women. And yeah, so we've got a lot of chapels all over the place, but they've been converted now to houses and restaurants and so on.
Hmm. Yeah, John Wesley's like the hero of of the Methodist Church.
Mm.
Yeah. So yeah, back to philosophy of mind, right? I think the most the biggest question in this field is the mind-body problem. I mean, I've heard that been thrown around so many times, but could you lay out exactly what the problem is?
I can try. So it's essentially the problem as to the relation between the concepts of matter and mind. It's called the mind-body problem, but body in Latin corpus is matter or body, right? So it's kind
Yep.
of it's beyond just the body now, as we understand it today. But it's the relation, yeah, the relationship between the mind and matter, as we understand it. So um, the so to address that question, you have to ask. There's two main kind of ways of responding to it. So number one, what do we mean by mind? Actually, what do we mean by matter? And what do we mean by relation? If you really want to go into it, right?
Hmm.
And with that third one, what is a relation? What is relation? Then we look at different relations, proposed relations between mind and matter. So, classically, you've got dualism, substance dualism. So mind and matter are two distinct substances, which means they kind of they can exist on their own, independently of each other, very basically. Descartes, Plato is famous for this. Bergson, they all have different types of dualism, though. Another very common, I'd say probably the default position in the West today is physicalism or materialism. So that's the idea that there's one fundamental substance, it's called material monism as well, and that's matter. And then within physicalism, I'd say you've got two main options. You've got the psychoneural identity theory, which is the view that mind is the brain, or the particular parts of the brain correlated, or well, not even correlated, identical to consciousness. And then you've got what's more common today and was common 100 years ago, emergentism, which is the view that the brain makes emerge the mind. And the mystery as to how that happens is strictly speaking called the hard problem of consciousness, coined by David
Yep.
Chalmers in 1995. So he says, how is it that things moving in the brain, like physical, whatever, how does that relate to curiosity or the color red or green or anger or moods or whatever, right? But of course, within the hard problem of consciousness, the assumption is emergentism, how does it emerge, right? Rather than does it emerge? So anyway, so you have dualism, physicalism of different types, and then you have other options which in the 20th century were kind of excluded. So idealism, so that's a kind of inverse of materialism. So the fundamental substance is idea or mind, and matter is just a kind of projection, as it were, of the mind, an illusion in a way. And you've got a great legacy, a great history of idealists. So George Berkeley, for example, Immanuel Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, famously, Schopenhauer, and many wonderful thinkers. I was an idealist myself for a while, and perhaps I am still to a certain extent. And then, so you got, what have I said? Dualism, physicalism, idealism. You've got what you can call absolute monism or neutral monism, which is the view that mind and matter are not substances, but rather expressions of a deeper substance. So the main exponent of this is Spinoza, the philosopher Spinoza, who died in 1677. And so for him, mind and matter are actually the same thing. They're just seen from a different point of view, so also known as double aspect monism. But for Spinoza, these are two expressions that humans have of the one substance that he also calls God and he calls nature. That's why he's also a pantheist. But that's the human perception. There's an infinity of other ways to see that one substance. We can talk about that if you like. And then there are other views as well. Like I'd say a fifth one would be like transcendentalism. So there's the mind and matter are in the actual world, but if you include a broader realm, the real world, then you would include Platonic forms or like universals. Like, for example, the truth of the Pythagorean theorem would be something that is real, but it's not physical, the truth,
Yep.
and it's not mental because it's true whether or not anyone ever thinks it or has ever thought about it, right? And there's actually good reasons for that. I mean, it's been debate for thousands of years whether this Platonia exists from Plato, but you see it before Plato and Pythagoras and so on. Anyway, so there's five options, and all of those ramify into different theories, and there are others as well. But I'd say these are the four core ways of addressing the mind matter problem.
Yeah, and I think the sheer number of these theories that come up, right, and I guess how compelling each of them roughly are, points to how difficult the mind matter problem really is, right? And I
Yeah.
think I want to zoom in on idealism ju right now because just now you said that it's something that was the most compelling to you, if I'm saying that right. Um,
Once.
yeah, what are your thoughts on idealism? How does it compare, and why do you think that it's compelling in the first place? Because I think when most people hear of it in the beginning, it's sort of the easiest one to write off because how can you possibly forget about the physical world, right? How can you say that mind is all that there is? Yeah.
Also, it's got interesting political dimensions because, so for example, I told you that in philosophy of mind generally, at least in the 20th century, we didn't even look at idealism. It wasn't even considered as a viable option. One of the reasons for that is because idealism was associated with German philosophy. So I mentioned Kant, Fichte, Hegel, Schelling, and so on, and Schopenhauer. And after the wars, there was a real anti-German sort of sentiment, and I
Yeah.
think that contributed to its decline. Also, just fashions in philosophy. I mean, I should say that German idealism, from these people I mentioned, influenced absolute idealism in Britain or British idealism. Um, and that was kind of quite prevalent in Oxbridge from about 1875 to 1925, but something that I was never taught as an undergrad, philosophy undergrad, strangely. Um, and so there were then, like in the early 20th century, there was a fight against that from the analytic side, for people like Moore and Aja Eyre, people like that. Also from the sort of more continental side, you got a lot of neo-Marxists who are very much against any form of idealism. And so critical theory, for example, from Horkheimer, he wrote an argument saying there's no such thing as metaphysics, it's just materialism. That's the only possible
Mm.
answer. So that Marxist kind of materialism had a huge influence on academia in the West as well. So you had these prongs against idealism, which were really more political than philosophical or scientific. I mean, it was never like fully refuted. It was just, things moved on for other reasons. Anyway, what is it? So there's different forms of it. I'd say there's two main forms. You get the subjective idealism of Bishop Berkeley, which is that quite extreme version, which is that matter is a complete illusion. We only know that the mind, we only know that we exist. We only have access to our own minds, to mentality, and we've got no reason to actually infer that matter is real. It's because when we see matter, it's a color, which is mental, or it's a feeling, physical
Mm.
feeling, which is mental, all of that is mental. So the argument is the inference that there's an objective existence outside of perception is unsound, according to George Berkeley, anyway. That's one kind of idealism. The other
Sorry,
kind,
just to interrupt, is that similar to like the brain in the vat experiment? Kind of the idea that all your senses could just be an illusion, for example, and the material world doesn't exist.
it's very similar, except for the fact that the brain in the vat is a physical thing. So that's the basis
Right.
of it all. Right? So it's
Okay.
not even, it's all, but I
Mm.
should, anyway, and then the other form is transcendental or critical idealism from Kant, Immanuel Kant, and he lived about 200 years ago. So it's first critique of pure judgment. And this is the idea that everything we can know is phenomenal, by which he means, mental, experiential, so colors and sounds, we know this is mental. With Berkeley, he says, yeah, we can't infer that there are outside material objects. But unlike Berkeley, he says Kant says we don't know actually what's, as it were, outside of the mind. Um, he even says that we not only do we project colors and sounds and so on, we also project space and time and causality. So even that we can't know is out there, as it were, right? The universe in itself, reality in itself, noumenon, might be, for all we know, aspatial, atemporal, acausal. But this caused a lot of problems. There were some paradoxes in that, and that led to Hegel really, who said, who basically said that, so not quite a return to Berkeley, but it was a view that we are, we do know what the outside world is, and that outside world is mental. So he's a called a dialectical idealist, but the understanding of that is a logical process that unravels logically, but also one can see it historically, and that led to Marx. But Marx turned that dialectic progress, which you can see in history, from idealist from an idealist philosophy to a materialist one. So there's still Hegel behind the Marxist critique of idealism, strangely. But anyway, so that's what idealism is. Basically, so essentially it's the idea that all is mind. But the difference is, does that mean, is it all is mind just for us, or are we saying that all is mind objectively? And that's the main differences. But there are many different varieties, you know. Every different philosopher's got a slightly different take.
Right. So what makes it the most compelling in your opinion? Or at least what's the steel man for idealism?
Well, I suppose, I mean, if I were to choose one, I'd go with Schopenhauer's probably, who comes out of Kant, but he criticizes Kant's ethical theory based on it. But I was a Schopenhauerian for a few years. But his, I don't know, I suppose the argument is that, well, first, the negative critique is, which has been the case for many centuries, we simply have no scientific understanding of how mind can come out of non-mind, so dead matter, you know, or rather, I should say, insentient matter. It just seems like a complete magical miracle. But we can be sure, and this is all debatable, we can be sure that our minds exist, and we can't be sure that matter exists. And we can, when we analyze what we understand by matter, we reduce it, like I said, to sense perceptions. And that could include the perception of space, even three-dimensional space. But it is an inference. And we do, I think even everyone, even scientists would accept that we do, you know, see the world in a human way. So there is compelling reasons for it. However, the reason I'm not really an idealist anymore, I'm not a materialist either, but there was a debate in Germany and then later in Britain between idealism and realism, or rather realism and representationalism. And the idea with the difference there is that like philosophers such as Alfred North Whitehead, who was an organic realist, they argued that although we do represent the world to a certain extent, to a certain human extent, there are aspects of the world out there which directly come in and become part of us. So if you criticized the idea of matter as insentient, then one would argue this, but if matter is sentient, if there's an element of consciousness within all things, like panpsychism, then that sentience would, well, through detailed argument in Whitehead, could become part of our own consciousness, you know. So in other words, when we see light, it's not just, we don't just represent it as a color, but rather there's a certain feeling within light that comes within us as well. But when we think of matter, we abstract away that feeling generally because it's not empirical, as it were, right? It's not intersubjective. So we think that matter, or let's say matter energy, is something that excludes sentience, but that's only because of the problem of other minds. You know, you can't directly perceive certain types of mentality. So the idea with realists is that actually we do have direct access to the real world, not fully, but to a certain extent. And that's like for Whitehead, that was feeling, you know, we can actually feel external feelings, as it were, and they become part of our feeling. So when we don't just infer, we don't go into a room and infer happiness or whatever because people are smiling, but it sort of comes in through life and through memory as well. So anyway, there's this long debate between the representationalists and realists. A great figure there is F.H. Bradley, who was known as a British idealist, but he said, I don't know if I'm an idealist or a realist. And he has, I should say, sorry if I'm getting too
No, it's okay.
So one extreme form of idealism is called solipsism, right? So you only know that your own mind exists, and that's it. You don't even know other minds exist, right? That's all you have access to. But F.H. Bradley, in his book Appearance and Reality, chapter on solipsism, I really recommend to everyone. He argues that actually, why are we not assuming when we have, let's say, a feeling that it's only ours? You know, is that a direct perception that it's only ours, or is that an inference? And he argues actually that's an inference. So we can't actually be just, assume that our minds are the only thing that exists, contrary to what a lot of people think. And from that, like if you say that, okay, well, maybe we share feelings then you get into this realism. So the outside world becomes part of the inside world, as it were. But all of that debate was kind of shut down after the Second World War, where there was just this intense rejection of metaphysics, and except for one type of metaphysics, which was the physicalist option. And that became sort of, continued or crystallized as a kind of metaphysical basis of science, Western science as we know, implicitly. It was never really, there was never a great philosopher of physicalism. It was just kind of just became the default because of criticism, kind of unfair criticism of metaphysics. But 20 years ago, we went through the metaphysical turn. So we're teaching metaphysics at university again. It's a lot. I should just say another thing about metaphysics, quite interesting, because the European understanding of the word metaphysics, which comes from Aristotle's book, Metaphysics, is a rigorous logical discipline. It's about like the nature of causality, of modality, like necessity and impossibility, space and time, and metaphysics of mind and so on.
Yep.
Whereas in America, metaphysics generally has more of a new age connotation or that mystical connotation, which it doesn't have in Britain. So it's quite interesting sometimes online when one talks about metaphysics and Americans think you're sort of just speaking all magically and whatever. Whereas, like in Europe, Britain, Germany, Sweden, whatever. Well, maybe not Sweden, Britain, Germany, certainly. It's kind of quite the opposite. It's a science, in the original sense of science, being a disciplined methodological study of something.
Very interesting. I did not know that the two continents kind of have a different view of
Yeah,
metaphysics.
it's odd. I only discovered recently. I mean, there is some. I looked on the Oxford Dictionary, and there's some old British uses of metaphysics as a kind of mysticism, but it's it originally comes from Aristotle's book Metaphysics, which it's just a collection of some notes from him that collated together, and then an editor hundreds of years later just put it after the book Physics, Aristotle's book Physics, right? And meta means after or beyond, and so that's how it got the name. Aristotle didn't use the term. He used first philosophy, the core principles.
I see. Very
And so
interesting.
within that book, you get the basis of what metaphysics is today. So, like I was saying, causality, form, and universals and stuff like that.
Hmm.
What do you take a do you have a metaphysical preference or?
No, I guess I don't. I haven't dabbled too much in metaphysics myself, so I dare not comment too much. Yeah, but I think a nice segue that you gave, right, was back to looping back to physicalism, and one of the things you touched on was emergentism, and I think that's something that stands out at first when it's first presented to you. It seems promising that because of the complexity of our brains, for example, right, that it kind of um, spawns or brings together all the physical properties to emerge a
Mm.
mental property. And on the surface, it sounds promising, but it does have some major problems, right? And I'm sure that we are both aware of it. Could you explain what are the issues with emergentism?
Yeah. The key problems relate to what one can call upward causation and downward causation. So, the word emergentism, of course, implies upward causation. And there's two main varieties of it, I should say. There's epiphenomenalism. Apologies for all the isms here. Epiphenomenalism is the view that the brain makes the mind emerge, but that the mind has no causal effect back upon the brain and body and
Yep.
world, right? And so famously, Thomas Huxley famously wrote about this in the 1870s, and he was a friend of Darwin's. Darwin disagreed with him, interestingly, regarding this. But it's interesting how it ties in with evolution, theory of evolution. But so the analogy is that the mind is like steam coming out of a locomotive train, So it's a byproduct. It has no causal efficacy. It doesn't push the train at all. But emergentists today generally don't want to accept that because for evolutionary reasons. And this is, here comes the problems, right? And it relates to free will. Karl Popper, F.H. Bradley, whom I mentioned, William James, a number of very good thinkers have made this point. Why did consciousness, mentality, experience, whatever you want to call it, sentience, why did consciousness evolve if it serves no purpose, if it can do nothing, right? In other words, if it doesn't have mental causation, if epiphenomenalism is true, why did it emerge? Presumably not just in mankind, but also in many other animals, right? And perhaps beyond that. There are things that evolve in nature which play no purpose. They're called spandrels, like the human chin, for example. But they're usually species specific. So, humans have chins, birds don't. And so most, no other species do, I don't think, not even other apes. But so consciousness is not really like a spandrel. And surely we like to think that consciousness serves a purpose. So, for example, like most people would say, like surely I can distinguish like red berries from the green leaves, right? That's very helpful for my survival, or I can perceive a threat and I run, or the human intelligence has led to, the intelligence, the thinking alone has led to the development of civilization, technology, and whatever, right? It's very hard to deny that. Or like, extreme focus on Hegel or whatever, right, leads to you writing something. Or meditation, there's so many examples, but it's very hard to deny that consciousness plays no role in life, right? So if you want to accept and to deny it can be seen as anti-evolutionary, anti-biological, right?
Yep.
You want to accept mental causation, but the problem is emergentism and mental causation don't cohere, really. The reason it's called the exclusion problem, and Jae-Kwon Kim is a very Korean American philosopher who's the best at explaining this. But essentially, it's the problem with mental causation is firstly that it's not a known force of nature, right? It's not electromagnetism, gravity, strong or weak nuclear force, mentality. So it doesn't fit in with physics, but it does fit in with biology, evolution, right? So it's not a known force of nature. Secondly, there's a problem within the exclusion problem called overdetermination, which is hard to explain now without diagrams, but if I can try quickly. If, let's say, you accept that mental causation is real, there's two types of mental causation generally. There's mental to mental, so my thought of green to my thought of a tree, for example. And mental to physical, so my desire for a cup of tea to my legs walking to the kitchen to make it, right? Psychophysical. It seems that overdetermination means that an event has two sufficient causes. So two causes that are adequate to fulfill the effect. So let's say I want to ask a question, what caused my thought of a tree in emergentism? Well, first of all, you say, well, you thought green just earlier, and that caused your thought of the tree. That's mental causation. But at the same time, emergentists will like saying, well, no, your brain state caused your thought of the tree, right? Upward causation, as it were, rather than lateral causation here. And you would have like two causes for the same event, which seems for everything, every thought you ever have, right? That's just one example. Everything that happens in your mind. So that just seems unparsimonious. You'd think, well, that's unless nature doesn't waste its time like that, right? So you have that issue. And then you have this, and I should say that what's overdetermined is thought, but you can also say, if you're looking, you can also say that the brain state is overdetermined, or the physical state, because maybe a mental state causes a physical state, but also the prior physical state caused that prior physical state. So the overdetermination of the mental and the overdetermination of the physical, which are concomitant, right? Concurrent. And then you've got this other weird problem that, okay, if all of my mind is generated by my brain, emerges from my brain, then if there is mental causation downwards, that would change my brain. And then that would have a like feedback loop up on my mind again, but then that would have a feedback loop. And you get this paradox of indeterminacy between
which came first, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. So it just seems like emergentism, although it's like very easy to say. And one more thing about emergentism quickly. What emerges, right, is something that is most emergentists will say is not Um, although it's although it stems from the brain, it's not fully reducible in explanatory terms to the brain, because what emerges, they say, is novelty, or like mental causation. Now, you don't get mental causation in the brain. You just get physical causation, right? Electromagnetic causation, would say. But you get novelty with emergence. And again, that just seems completely miraculous. The point is, right, emergentism, although it is probably the standard basis of neuroscience really for the last 50 years, it's a metaphysical belief, and it's not empirically provable. You can prove the correlates, but you can't empirically show how those correlates between mind and matter are actually related, just that they are correlated. That's it, right? So then you have to determine whether the metaphysical theory that might underlie that correlation is inherently coherent. And my view is that it's not. Emergentism doesn't really make sense. It's a bit of a magical proposition.
Yeah.
So as a result, that's another reason I turn to not idealism so much as panpsychism, which is related, but it's the view that all is mind. Because if we say that mind and matter, like with Spinoza now, are merely different expressions of the same thing, same substance, that we can see as mind or matter, then you don't get upward causation, don't get downward causation. You just get lateral causation, which is not problematic. But the consequence of that is that you'd have to say that all of matter also is mental, and that's panpsychism.
Yep.
So panpsychism does solve a lot of the problems that emergentism brings with it. However, panpsychism also has its problems.
Its own problems, yeah.
So I'm not, I don't, nobody is sure about what the truth is here,
Yeah, so I mean it's a nice segue into panpsychism. I think there's been a lot of discourse lately, right, on panpsychism. I'm not sure if it's just me, but I've been seeing a lot more content on panpsychism, a lot more awareness in the intellectual space. I think Annika Harris, right, she's been going around on tour, speaking to many different people about her 10-hour long documentary on panpsychism. And I mean, the first person that I heard panpsychism from was actually Philip Goff. So when I first heard it, and I'm sure many people's reactions to it are quite visceral at the beginning, which is like, what do you mean
Mm,
consciousness can be, it is an intrinsic part of matter all the way down to an atom, right? But
mm,
I guess when you start to give it some thought and realize also that a lot of the other theories that we have suffer from roughly the same kind of unfalsifiable
yeah,
issues, right? Then you start to give it a bit more credence and thought.
yeah,
So real quick, so I have some thoughts on panpsychism, but I want to lay some groundwork first on,
okay.
I guess the biggest criticism, which is the combination problem, right? Yeah, and why you think some people have this kind of visceral reaction to
Mm.
panpsychism.
Okay. Well, quickly, the combination problem is the problem as to how basic mental states, like feelings, let's say, can combine to create a unified, larger sentience, as it were. So, like, how can the sentience of neurons, for example, combine to create the sentience of yourself? How do they combine, basically? How do mental things combine? There are different variants of it as well. Like, how can you get one type of mental quality from another? So, how could you get like colors out of what might be primitive feelings, for example? And so on. Um, Personally, I think the way out of that is through Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy of pan-experientialism, which is a type of panpsychism, which is the view that combination lies at the root of reality. So with pan-experientialism, you don't get the combination problem. We can talk about that if you like. But anyway, why is it so shocking to people? Well, it's quite interesting because I mean, this is like political, religious, historical, right? And certainly I mean, in my 20s, I was kind of, pretty hardcore physicalist. And the way I sort of got at well, I'm not anymore is because I was asked like, well, which type of physicalist is the most, which kind of physicalism is the most plausible? And then when you look at the details and you think, actually, that sort of implies this and that, and then you move on, right? So, um, why is panpsychism such a shock to people? So, well, it's a long story, but the ancient Greeks used to think of according to R.G. Collingwood, the ancient Greeks, and I'm only talking about Europe here. It's interesting how it relates to the rest of the world, but R.G. Collingwood writes that English philosopher, the ancient Greeks used to think of the universe as an organism. That was the metaphor. And since the 17th century, we've thought about the universe as a machine, tying in with the Industrial Revolution and whatever. And with dualism, you have a ghost in the machine. There's matter is the machine, it's insentient, and then there's a soul within it for humans, for Descartes. And what seems to have happened historically, and I should say before the 17th century, the scholastics were Aristotelians, and Aristotle was not exactly a panpsychist, but there were certain forms of there's a vegetative soul, for example. Plants had a basic form of sentience and so on. It wasn't like human consciousness, but it's just a basic desire for sun and water and whatnot. This was very common medieval Christianity, even arguably, but with the 17th century, you suddenly got this view of the universe as completely dead, as a machine, like I say, instead of an organism. Instead of a living organism, we saw the universe as a machine. And then how do we explain the mind? Well, that's an addition. That's a kind of addition that God has put into us. And then historically, what happened is this way of thinking, which is sort of Christian, because God created the universe, and the universe therefore is not God. It's therefore not necessarily minded, but God has given us a soul. Anyway, Western history seems to have said that, well, we'll leave the soul to the church and we'll leave the machine to science. And the machine is completely dead. And, science has rolled with that kind of metaphysics. And then you get the hard mind matter problem, the hard problem of consciousness. That, well, how the hell do we get the mind out of it if we accept the mind exists?
Yeah.
But most people in that ideology, which is like a cultural metaphysics, which is so prevalent that it's like, as I say, water for a fish. You don't see it. Because that's just the considered default metaphysics for a few hundred years now, but not 1,000 years. When people say, wait a minute, it's not a machine. The machine, like the outside world is alive, like panpsychism, the view that everything has consciousness. That seems just like a great shock. And I think that's one of the key reasons why people just, 15 years ago would have dismissed it fully, but now, you're getting some serious scientists who are sort of promoting it, as well as philosophers like Galen Strawson. And so it's making a comeback. And I should say, Spinoza was a panpsychist. Like these great thinkers, Leibniz, who invented the calculus with Newton. He was a panpsychist. Whitehead, William James, eventually, Fechner. There's so many great thinkers in the past who were panpsychists. Even Francis Bacon, who a lot of people think is one of the founders of modern science, he was a panpsychist. If you read him carefully. So it's not illogical. It's just a completely different way of looking at the universe. And that's, I think, just the Western mind is not ready for it. It's just like it's too alien because of its history.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up religion. It's something that I wanted to ask you, which was, do you think it's truly incompatible with theism or Judeo-Christian thinking? Is there any way that they can reconcile with each other,
I think so, yeah. I mean, I don't think they're incompatible. I think the main kind of stumbling block perhaps is, I mentioned Spinoza as a panpsychist, so he's also a pantheist, which means that the universe is God.
Yeah.
And you can sort of understand like the reasons for panpsychism, pantheism being compatible. I mean, they are Spinoza. But with Christianity, it's more of a creator and created. And so it's perhaps a little bit more difficult because the created world is not necessarily a living world. Some of it is, but not all of it. And but where with panpsychism, everything is an organism, even a molecule, right? An atom.
Yep.
And also this notion of the soul that you get in Christianity, it's only humans are judged and
Yeah.
go to hell in some of the denominations, right? Not animals. So therefore you get a bit more of a anthropocentric view, human-based view that, well, really consciousness pertains to mankind and not the rest. Descartes, he didn't even think that other mammals had consciousness, only humans. So but I think, however, having said all that, like I said, medieval Christianity before the 17th century, then I think that was kind of a bit more animist, in its thinking, because it incorporated a lot of Plato and Aristotle, through the thinkers.
Mm.
And Plato said the sun is a god, and he was not quite a panpsychist, but learned more that way. And Aristotle, as I said, you know, learned more that way. And that was incorporated into Christianity. And that was, panpsychism wouldn't have been a shock to the medievals in Europe, but it is today because of the scientific revolution, which is actually really also a metaphysical revolution. And that over the centuries, that was just more compounded more and more. The 20th century, I would say, is probably the most reductive. I think we've come out of it a little bit, but the 20th century really pushed that reductive materialism to an extreme, to the extent that here's another ism, eliminativism. You didn't even consciousness didn't even exist. So you had like theories like logical behaviorism, which
Hmm.
which claim that like there's no happiness, it's just smiles or laughing or whatever. That's it. And consciousness was a bad word in science until the 90s, really, the late 20th century.
Hmm.
But now,
Sorry, would you say that was it eliminatism?
eliminate, you eliminate the mind, eliminate.
Eliminatism. So it's kind of like to assume that everyone is a philosophical zombie, right?
Pretty
Even
much.
yourself.
Yeah. And that led to all the paradoxes, the belief that there are no beliefs and so on,
Yeah,
or there are no feelings. So,
strange.
but it seemed scientifically respectable. So, okay, you don't have to deal with the mind. We don't have any hard problem of consciousness or mind matter problem. There's just the empirical. We can just look at behavior. We can look at movement of neurons, and that is all we need. That was very consoling, of course, to that methodology and that metaphysics, but didn't lead anywhere, didn't go
Hmm.
anywhere, led to logical paradoxes, as I say. And so I don't think many people, there are a few, but not many people really adopt it anymore.
So this reminds me of something like illusionism, in the sense that you could say under eliminativism, sorry, too many isms, the the sort of consciousness that you experience, or even to some extent the awareness that you have of what your thoughts are, could be purely an illusion. So you're just you're an observer essentially, right? And you're seeing these thoughts and physical causations flow along, and then it just comes to the level of consciousness, but you are completely you have no control over it essentially. And it runs into the same problem that you were talking about just now, which is why would evolution allow for something like that, right? Would you say that's a fair comparison?
Um, yeah, you'd have to write it as an essay on how to say it's fair, but I will say that one, Adam Toon is a sort of illusionist. He's a philosopher at Exeter University, a friend of mine. I mean, he gave a talk, and there's some elements of it, I think, which are feasible. So, for example, take the word belief, mentioned. What is a belief? Is that a mental state? Well, it's arguable that actually a belief can be reduced to certain behaviors. So if you
Yeah.
believe Christianity, you will go to church on Sundays and you'll do prayers and so on, right? It's rather than it being like some kind of mental state for which you might be able to find neural correlates. I can
Mm.
accept that. But what I can't accept is the dismissal of qualia. They don't like the word, like color red or something, or they don't really
Yeah.
dismiss it, but they try to reduce it into more mechanist terms. And I just I don't think that works. It never persuades me.
Mm. Okay, fair enough. So, I'm conscious of time. Got about 10 minutes left, and I've got two things I want to cover. One thing related to panpsychism, and this is in relation to artificial intelligence, AI, as the buzzword is going around these days. So it seems to me like panpsychism is somewhat incompatible with the idea that AI can eventually become conscious. So hear me out, right? So if panpsychism assumes that matter itself is what's responsible for consciousness, then even if we approach something to the level of human intelligence in an AI system, something that's fully autonomous, has its own ideas, creativity, can think on the intellectual capacity of a human, no matter how close it approximates a human mind, it can never be called conscious because the what spawns from AI reasoning is not matter, but rather a series of algorithms or what have you. These are not material things that create the uh, the mind that is AI. Yeah. Do
Mm.
you think that's the right way of thinking about it?
Um, Possibly. I mean, I'm very it's a really interesting question, this. I was in California recently, Esalen, and near Silicon Valley, and I remember this woman who worked there. She said, "We've created the system that insists it's conscious, and we don't know, number one, what consciousness is, and number two, we don't know whether we should prohibit it from saying it." Um, and it's becoming, yeah, obviously it's become a very popular topic now. So with your point, yeah, so do you need a kind of material base as a correlate of consciousness rather than the base that AI has? It's an interesting one. If you say, if for example, you say you need a brain, like a squishy brain, um, as a hardware, as it were, it's called, here's another ism for you, biological naturalism. So that would deny it to AI. But the problem with that, of course, is we don't really know what it is in the biological mechanism that makes emerge the brain or how it relates, right? As we've discussed. So if you don't know what it is, it's hard to say that it's necessary because we don't know. We can't, verify or falsify how it is necessary if it is. Um, Also, another interesting thing with regard to that, um, the level, the grain, as it's called, like the level of abstraction you need to go to replicate consciousness. So some people think that you need to go to the level of neuron firing, right? And you can then replicate that with ones and zeros, fire or not. But as maybe that's just completely insufficient. I mean, maybe, for example, you need to look at which neurotransmitters are being fired, right? For example,
Mm, yep.
or maybe you need to go maybe even deeper at a deeper level and think, well, every neuron, as you know better than I do, is a very complex cell, and it has a nucleus. I know it has proteins that walk along tubules and so on. Maybe if we don't know what it is in the brain that makes merge the mind, then for all we know, perhaps these tubules are a necessary condition for consciousness. Penrose and Amroth, of course, have got this theory which claim it is. So because we don't know, because we have the mind-body problem as relates to the human body and mind, we can't yet determine whether AI is going to be conscious or not. We can't determine what John Searle famously said, how can we determine whether we're simulating consciousness or emulating it, right? Or
Mm,
like recreating it. We can't because you can imagine a robot which cries and says, "Listen, I'm conscious, you have to believe me, how can you deny this to me? I've got my rights and stuff." But you can imagine an actor doing that, it's
yeah.
quite, easily design a robot to emulate that, right? To copy that rather. So here's another issue, right? Which is the problem of other minds.
Mm,
Um, I can't directly, feel your feelings or, see your thoughts or, whatever, right? I can guess them, I can infer them if you tell me, or if you're crying or something, I can sort of infer you're sad. But you might be lying, right? You might be acting, might be on a film set or whatever, right? Or you might be trying to
mm.
deceive. Um,
I mean, it might
because
not
it's
even be known to me, really.
yeah,
Yeah.
right, exactly, right. You don't know yourself quite often, right? So one doesn't. So we can't simply say that behavior is enough. I mean, the Turing test famously is behavior. That was Alan Turing wrote this Turing test in the
Yeah.
50s. 1950 when logical behaviorism was all the rage. But of course, not many people believe that anymore. So there has to be something more. There's another aspect to all of this, which I haven't really delved into yet, a type of dualism that I didn't talk about, which was Bergson's. And this relates to the idea that the brain, the relation of mind and matter is like the relation between a computer and the internet, or a radio and a BBC program, right? So the brain might be a receiver, and so with that theory, you would still get neural correlates of consciousness, of course, but just like you would get in a radio, you could even guess what's being played by looking at the circuitry. You could recreate the BBC at one news or something like that, right? Doesn't mean that the radio produces the news. And
Mm.
if I mean, there's a lot of problems with that theory as well. But if we were to entertain it, then with AI, I mean, maybe then it's possible to create a computer system that could receive consciousness like the brain does. But again, all of this depends on our, a general metaphysics of mind in the first place, our general theory of
Yep.
consciousness. And all of that, once you have that, then you can determine whether plants have consciousness, or whether, panpsychism is true, or whether AI has consciousness. You can't start at AI. You can't start
Mm.
at that software level and decide it. It wouldn't work, You can't even, I mean, some people say, I know there's two schools of thought that people developing AI can be basing it on neuroscience, or they think they can recreate it synthetically, as it were. But if you look at the neuroscience, there's different theories in neuroscience as to what consciousness is and how it relates to the brain, and all of them are on a deeper level problematic anyway. Like I said, I told you the problems of emergentism. There's also problems with psychoneural identity theory and other types of physicalism as well. In fact, there's problems with all of them, right? But so yeah, I'm not. I don't think we'll get an answer soon to that AI question.
Yep.
However, sociologically, if people believe that AI is conscious, it will change the world anyway.
It will. It will. Yeah, I mean, I think for me it boils down to definition, right? Definitionally, what are we calling consciousness, sentience, awareness, the soul, something that we ascribe value to, whatever it is. Yeah, and then unfortunately, because this isn't the realm of empiricism, it's not something that we can sort of anchor down in biology, right? It sort of runs into the same problem of moral frameworks and what you choose to subscribe to at the end of the day. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean, I would love to continue, but I just have one real quick question that it's a completely different thing because I was hoping to go down there. But yeah, let's switch gears a bit to ask you, and I know it's probably hard to summarize in a short amount of time, but the question I have for you is that on the topic of free will, during a psychedelic trip, there is a very clear induced feeling of noesis that can be felt, right? Which is the feeling that something is extremely meaningful to you and that it makes sense in the context of the universe in that point in time. I'm wondering if the feeling of noesis, the noetic feeling, can be fabricated or at least induced by a chemical. What does that
Mhm.
say about our strong feelings of will? Yeah.
Uh, um, when you say our strong feelings of will, do you mean will as in desire or as in free will?
So I would define it as our feeling of agency, the feeling of yes, desire and wanting to act in the world. Yeah, this inseparable feeling that what we
Yeah.
choose to do is our own. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, uh, I think, I mean, this is the deepest question. I think I'd say this, that a lot of psychedelic experiences, noetic experiences, are pantheistic. So you think like, the universe is God, or all is one, and very, very common for the last 2,000 years, and or more. And that generally is a monism, a monism in philosophy, or a pantheism in religion. And a monism, as I've intimated before, is the idea that there's not upward or downward causation, because there's not two levels. There's one mono condition level of substance of reality. And thus, the implication of that would be that there is there is mental causation, but it's not necessarily free. So, one physico-psychological causes no, one physico-psychological state causes another
Mm.
psychophysical state, right? And that could still be determined by prior states, as Spinoza believes. He doesn't believe there's any free will, because the universe has to be perfect. If the universe is perfect, it can't change in any other way. So I think that's one way you could go with a noetic experience that happens to be pantheistic. And if you really follow the logic, I suppose after the trip rather than during it, you might think that you are not free at all, but passive. But that's cool, because Spinoza's whole point, the reason his metaphysical book is called the Ethics, is because, ironically, he says, freedom is the understanding that everything is determined, right? When you understand it, that everything that happened had to have happened, it gives you a tranquility of mind. You can't blame anyone for anything, or praise anyone, and you just accept life as it is. And that's a very consoling thing. And it's a way of controlling your negative emotions, he writes, And the ultimate state of that, he says, the intellectual love of God or nature, because God is nature for him, is to understand that the more you understand God or nature, the more you understand yourself, and you understand that everything you've thought and done had to be like that, and until you attain a total fusion with God, and that is the intellectual love of God, and perhaps that is akin to the certain noetic feelings, but not all of them. There are different ones. There's interesting different unitive states, different forms of noeticism. And I certainly don't know the answer to this, but I think that when we look at psychedelics, metaphysics is quite crucial to really framing it. And that's why I am under contract with Bloomsbury writing the Psychedelic Metaphysics Manual, which hopefully will compare metaphysics of mind theories that we've been discussing with certain psychedelic states.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a very fitting place to end. Thank you for trying to answer my very difficult question.
Oh,
Um, as a
sorry.
closing question, I want to ask you, who do you think is one person everyone should be listening to right now?
Do you mean a living person or
Yes, a
sorry?
living person. Yes.
Gosh. Galen Strawson, who was my PhD examiner, I always find really interesting, very logical, straight-minded panpsychist, but analytic philosopher. I'd recommend him. Um,
Okay.
yeah, let's go with him.
Yeah, Galen Strawson. All right. Thank you, Peter, for taking the time to be here to speak with me. I think it was extremely insightful for me, and thank you for answering my questions. Yeah.
Thanks for having me. Fascinating questions. A bit too deep for me, perhaps, but
Too early in the day.
I enjoyed trying at least. So thank you. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you.